I never thought I'd be flirting with a guy in a neon orange vest and a hard hat, but here we are. It all started on a Tuesday, which, if you'd asked me that morning, I'd have said was the most boring day of the week. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee, leaning on the windowsill of my apartment that looks out onto the street where the new apartment complex was going up. Noise, dust, and all the usual chaos of construction had become background static in my life. But then he showed up. I first noticed him around lunchtime when the usual group of workers spilled out onto the sidewalk, eating sandwiches and laughing loudly enough to cut through the usual hum of machinery. He was tall, with this kind of easy confidence that made him stand out, even in a crowd of guys who looked like they'd been working all day. His skin was tanned, probably from working outside, and his hands were rough but careful with the way he held his water bottle. There was something about the way he smiled, a little crooked, like he was holding back a joke, that made me unexpectedly curious. I'd been eyeing the construction site for weeks now, partly because it promised to change the whole vibe of the street, and partly because of the small, unspoken daydream I'd been carrying around about maybe meeting someone new. Not that I'm usually one to put myself out there. I'm the kind of guy who likes his routine, his comfort zone, but that day, when he caught me staring and didn't look annoyed or weirded out, just kind of amused, I felt something shift. He walked over, dust kicking up around his boots, and just said, "Hey, you live around here? Thought I saw you watching us do our thing every day." His voice was easy, like we were old friends catching up, not strangers living in parallel worlds separated by a chain-link fence. I shrugged, trying to play it cool. "Yeah, just making sure you guys aren't slacking off. Someone's got to keep you honest." He laughed, deep and genuine, and then, out of nowhere, he asked, "Want a hard hat tour?" It's not every day you get to walk around a live construction site with full backstage access. I probably looked shocked, because I didn't answer right away. I mean, when's the last time a random guy invited you to hang out on a construction site? But something about the idea felt oddly thrilling. So I said yes. As he handed me a dusty hard hat and showed me how to put on the safety vest, I realized this wasn't just going to be a casual look at the building progress kind of thing. There was a spark in his eyes that told me this was the start of something unexpected. And honestly, I had no idea just how much my life was about to change, all because of a construction worker on my street and a hard hat tour. Putting on that hard hat felt almost surreal. I'm standing there, an office guy in a fluorescent vest, feeling way out of my element, and he's watching me with this grin that's both amused and kind of encouraging, like he knows this is a pretty weird moment for me. "So you're really gonna come with me?" he said, adjusting his own helmet. "Most people just stare from a safe distance and keep their hands in their pockets." I shrugged, trying to hide how nervous I was. "Yeah, well, I'm full of surprises." He laughed again, that easy sound that made the dust and noise around us suddenly feel less intrusive. "All right then, Mr. Surprise. Follow me." We hopped over some piles of wood, skirted around a few piles of gravel, and ducked under a low beam. He pointed out the parts of the building that were coming together, explaining things with this casual enthusiasm that made it clear he actually cared about what he was building, not just showing up for a paycheck. I was paying attention, honestly, but I couldn't stop sneaking glances at him. His hands had this kind of practiced strength, but when he traced along the frame of the building, there was a gentleness there. He caught me looking once and gave me a little wink that sent a weird flutter through my chest. "So," he said, "what do you do when you're not creeping on construction sites?" I laughed. "Not creeping, observing. Big difference." He smiled like he didn't totally buy it, but was willing to play along. "Fair. I'm Nate, by the way." I told him my name, and just like that, it felt less like a stranger was showing me a construction site and more like two people starting to talk. We moved over to this half-built staircase, and I realized the noise wasn't just background anymore. It was a soundtrack to something new. I found myself opening up more than I expected, talking about my job, boring IT stuff, and how I'd lived on this street for years but never really got to know the people around me. It felt nice, weirdly freeing, to talk without the usual walls I put up. Nate listened, really listened, and then shared a bit about why he got into construction. Said he liked building something real, something that lasts, that it wasn't just about the physical work but the pride in creating a space where people would live their lives. I nodded, kinda surprised at how much I was relating to that. Maybe because I'd just been feeling stuck, like my life was this endless loop of routines that didn't leave much room for, I don't know, anything exciting. At one point, we stopped near this big window frame, and the sunlight caught his face just right. I found myself wanting to say something, anything, but my mouth went dry. Instead, he looked over at me and said, "You know, it's weird how easy it is to talk when you're wearing a hard hat." I laughed, the tension breaking. "Yeah, maybe it's the helmet magic." He shook his head, smirking. "Or maybe it's the company." I felt my heart skip. For a second, all the noise and dust faded, and it was just the two of us, standing on a half-finished building with the whole city stretching out below. Then, out of nowhere, his phone buzzed and he glanced at it, his expression sobering a bit. "I gotta get back to the crew," he said, but there was a hesitation in his voice, like he didn't really want to leave. "Yeah, of course," I said, a little too quickly, not wanting the moment to end, but knowing it would. He looked back at me, this genuine look that made my chest tighten. "Listen, if you want, I can show you more tomorrow. Maybe when we're not surrounded by all this noise and chaos." I nodded because, honestly, I didn't want to say no. I'd like that. We exchanged numbers, which felt like a small but huge step. Then he gave me one last, lingering smile before turning back toward the site. I watched him go, feeling a weird mixture of excitement and disbelief. After he disappeared into the group of workers, I stood there for a minute, helmet still in my hand, thinking about how a random invitation and a hard hat had suddenly flipped my whole day, and maybe even my life, on its head. I had no idea what was coming next, but for once, that didn't scare me. It kind of thrilled me. The next day, I found myself standing on the sidewalk outside the construction site earlier than I'd planned, my phone buzzing in my pocket with a message from Nate. "Ready for round 2? Meet you at the corner in 15. I wasn't sure why I was so eager. Maybe it was the novelty of breaking my usual routine, or maybe it was just the pull of wanting to see him again. Either way, the butterflies fluttering in my stomach told me this was more than just casual curiosity. When Nate showed up, his hard hat was slightly tilted, and he was grinning like he'd been waiting just as impatiently as I had. The sun was higher in the sky, casting this warm glow over the site that made all the metal beams and unfinished walls look kind of majestic in a weird industrial way. "Ready to see the secret parts they don't let just anyone into?" he teased, handing me another reflective vest and helmet. I laughed and took them, feeling like I was stepping into some exclusive club. "Absolutely. Lead the way." We slipped past the usual barriers. Well, Nate did, and I followed, trying not to trip over stray boards or step on anything too sketchy. This time, the world inside the site felt a little less intimidating and a lot more alive. The sounds of drills and hammers were a constant backdrop, but Nate's presence made it feel less like noise and more like a rhythm we were sharing. As we walked, Nate showed me the plans pinned up on a makeshift board, explaining how the building was designed, where the apartments would be, and even where the rooftop garden was going to be. His eyes lit up when he talked about the garden like it was his favorite part of the whole thing. "I'm telling you," he said, "once this place is done, it's going to change everything around here. People are going to want to live here, hang out on the roof, maybe even start a little community." I nodded, thinking about how that sounded kind of perfect. Like a fresh start. Not just for the neighborhood, but maybe for me too. We ended up sitting on a stack of lumber during a break, and for the first time, the conversation shifted from small talk to something deeper. Nate told me about growing up in a small town, how he'd moved here chasing better opportunities, and how construction was a way to build something steady, something he could be proud of. I shared a bit about why I had stayed in this city, even though it sometimes felt suffocating. Part of it was family, part of it was comfort, but a bigger part was fear. Fear of change, fear of taking risks. Somehow, saying it out loud to him felt less heavy. He looked at me, his gaze steady and kind. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "you have to build your own foundation, piece by piece, not just in buildings, but in life." I swallowed hard, feeling like those words were meant for me. Maybe they were. The afternoon melted away faster than I expected, and before we knew it, the site was winding down for the day. Nate helped me take off the gear, And as we stood there, the bustling street suddenly felt quieter, more intimate. "So," he said, scratching the back of his neck, "I was thinking maybe next time we could grab a coffee or something? Off-site. I mean, if you want." I smiled, feeling like my heart was doing some kind of happy dance. "Yeah, I'd like that." We exchanged a quick text later that evening, making plans for the weekend. I went to bed that night with a smile on my face, a rare thing for me lately. The weekend came, and when I met Nate at the little coffee shop down the street, it felt like meeting a version of him I hadn't seen on the construction site. No hard hat, no vest, just a guy with a warm smile, a lightness in his laugh, and this way of making the world feel a little less heavy. We talked for hours, about everything and nothing. Music, dreams, the weird quirks of living in a city that was always changing. At one point, he reached across the table and brushed a stray lock of hair off my forehead, and my stomach did that ridiculous flip again. I realized then that this wasn't just a fling or a passing fancy. There was something real here, something I'd been waiting for without even knowing it. The more time I spent with Nate, the more I started to see this street and myself in a new light. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, like I was interesting and worth knowing. Maybe it was his steady kindness, the way he made the chaos of my life feel manageable. Or maybe it was just that, after years of feeling invisible, someone had finally asked me to come in from the sidelines and join the building process. Not just of an apartment complex, but of something way more important, a connection. And honestly, I couldn't wait to see where this was going. After that coffee date, things started to shift in a way I didn't expect. I found myself looking forward to Nate's texts, not just because he was funny or easy to talk to, but because there was this underlying warmth, like he genuinely wanted to know me. One evening, he messaged me, "Got a little surprise for you tomorrow. Meet me by the site at noon?" That was it. No explanation, just that. I wasn't sure what to expect, but surprise, coming from Nate always meant something interesting. When I showed up the next day, the site was quieter than usual. Most of the crew had knocked off early, and the afternoon sun was making shadows stretch long across the half-finished walls. Nate was already there, waiting by a stack of plywood, wearing his usual gear but with a grin that hinted he was up to something. "Ready for your surprise?" he asked, tossing me another hard hat. "Hit me," I replied, trying not to sound too eager. He led me through the site, taking a route I hadn't seen before, past areas still under construction, where the floor was just raw concrete and the walls were skeletal frames. Then he stopped at a set of tall, unfinished stairs and looked back at me. "Trust me," he said, voice low. I nodded, heart pounding. We climbed the stairs, and with every step, the city opened up more and more. When we finally reached the roof, I almost forgot to breathe. The skyline stretched out in every direction, the sun casting golden light over rooftops and trees and streets that I'd walked 100 times but never looked at like this. It felt like the world had opened up just for us. Nate pulled off his helmet and let his hair fall messily around his face. "This is the rooftop garden spot," he said, sweeping his arm over the empty space. "Eventually, there'll be plants, benches, maybe even some fairy lights. I wanted to show you this first because it's kind of my favorite part." I looked at him, the way his eyes were soft in the sunlight, and felt something shift inside me. "It's amazing," I said honestly. "I can see why you care so much about this place." He stepped closer, and suddenly the distance between us felt electric. "You know," he said quietly, "I've been thinking a lot about what it means to build something. It's not just bricks and wood. It's the people who use it, who make it home." I swallowed, suddenly aware of how close he was. Yeah, it's like everything we build is a chance to start over, to create something better than what was there before. He smiled, this slow, genuine smile that made my chest ache. Exactly. Then, without quite thinking it through, I reached out and brushed my fingers lightly against his hand. It was soft, warm, completely different from the roughness I'd noticed before. Nate looked at me for a long moment, and then, to my relief, he intertwined his fingers with mine. We stayed like that for a while, just holding hands and watching the city below. The noise from the street was distant now, and time seemed to slow down. When it was time to leave, neither of us said much. The silence between us was comfortable, full of promise. As we walked back down the stairs, Nate squeezed my hand gently. Over the next few weeks, our relationship grew in subtle but meaningful ways. We'd meet after work, share meals, talk about everything from our childhoods to our dreams for the future. He introduced me to some of his friends from the crew who welcomed me like I was one of their own, and I introduced him to my favorite spots around the city. One rainy night, we found ourselves huddled under the awning of a closed cafe, sharing a single umbrella and laughing at how soaked we'd gotten. Nate looked at me and said, "You ever think about how weird life is? How one random day can change everything?" I nodded, feeling my heart beat a little faster. "Yeah, especially when that day involves hard hats and rooftop tours." He grinned. "I'm glad I talked to you that day." "Me too," I said softly. There was something about Nate that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't before. Like I wasn't just another face in the crowd, but someone who mattered. And as the rain fell around us, I realized that maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something real. One evening, a few months in, Nate and I were sitting on my couch, tired but happy after a long day. He leaned his head on my shoulder, and I could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "I never thought I'd find someone like you," he murmured. I smiled, feeling tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "Me neither." We stayed there in silence for a while, wrapped up in each other and the quiet comfort of being together. Looking back now, I can't believe it all started with a simple invitation for a hard hat tour. Sometimes, life's best surprises come when you least expect them, and in the most unexpected places. After that quiet night on my couch, things started to feel even more real between us. Not just the easy smiles or the casual hangouts, but this growing sense that Nate and I were building something solid, something that wasn't just about fleeting moments or the thrill of novelty. It felt like a foundation, steady and sure. One Saturday afternoon, Nate invited me over to the site again, but this time not for a hard hat tour. He wanted me to meet his dad. I was nervous, not because I thought his dad would be intimidating, but because meeting family always felt like a big deal to me. It was like opening a door to your whole life and hoping the person on the other side would like what they saw. We met outside a little diner near the site, and from the moment I saw Nate's dad, I could tell where Nate got that easy confidence and warm smile. His dad was tall, with a weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors and a handshake that was firm but kind. "Hey, you must be the guy Nate's been telling me about," he said, eyes twinkling. "Good to finally meet you." "Likewise," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Nate squeezed my hand under the table, and that small touch gave me a little courage boost. The three of us sat down, and the conversation flowed surprisingly well, talking about the new building, the neighborhood, and even Nate's childhood stories that made both of them laugh. It felt like I was stepping deeper into Nate's world, and with every passing moment, I realized how much I wanted to be part of it. After lunch, Nate and I walked back toward the site, the afternoon sun warming our backs. He stopped suddenly and looked at me, eyes serious for the first time in a while. "You know, I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about how much you've become part of all this. The building, the neighborhood, my life." I smiled, feeling my heart speed up a bit. I was thinking the same. He reached out, taking both my hands in his. "I'm not great with words, but I want you to know that this, us, it means a lot. Like, more than I expected." I squeezed his hands back, feeling the weight and honesty in what he said. "Me too. I don't think I've ever felt this connected to someone before." There was a pause, heavy with possibility. Then Nate leaned in and kissed me, soft, a little hesitant, but full of everything that had been building between us. It was the kind of kiss that settles something in your chest, makes you feel like you're exactly where you're meant to be. From there, our relationship deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated. We started spending more weekends exploring the city, finding little hidden spots Nate hadn't known about, and I got to see the side of him that wasn't just the hardworking construction guy, but the dreamer who loved music, old movies, and had this ridiculous obsession with spicy food. One evening, after a long day at the site, Nate invited me to come with him to a crew barbecue in the park. I was a little intimidated at first. Most of the guys were covered in dirt and had this rough around the edges vibe that made me feel like a fish out of water. But Nate was by my side the whole time, introducing me and making sure I felt included. There was this moment when one of the crew members asked me what I did for work, and I gave my usual IT stuff answer, expecting a kind of glazed-over reaction. But instead, they nodded, genuinely interested, asking questions about my projects, and even sharing some stories about tech issues on site. It struck me then how much Nate had built for me, not just the apartment complex, but this bridge between two worlds I hadn't thought could connect. That night, as we walked home under a sky full of stars, Nate slipped his hand into mine, and I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. But like any story worth telling, it wasn't all smooth sailing. A few weeks later, work got busier, and Nate's hours stretched longer. Between deadlines and the ever-present pressure from the site managers, he started getting visibly stressed. I tried to be supportive, but there were moments when he'd come home exhausted, snapping at small things, or retreating into silence. One night, after a particularly rough day, he sat on my couch, head in his hands. "I don't want to mess this up," he said softly, voice barely above a whisper. "Work's been crazy, and I feel like I'm letting you down." I sat beside him, reaching out to touch his shoulder. "Hey, you're not messing anything up. Life gets hard sometimes. We deal with it together." He looked up, eyes raw, and I could see the weight he was carrying. I care about you, and I want this to work. But sometimes it feels like everything else is pulling me away. I nodded, understanding more than words could say. "We'll figure it out, no matter what." That night was a turning point. It wasn't about grand gestures or perfect moments. It was about showing up for each other when things got messy. And that's what Nate and I promised ourselves, that no matter what, we'd build something real. Not just with bricks and mortar, but with trust and patience. Because sometimes, love isn't about the easy parts. It's about sticking around when the dust settles and the noise fades, and knowing you're stronger together. Those weeks after that conversation were, well, they were a test. Nate's work schedule got crazier, and I won't lie, it was frustrating sometimes. Not because of him, but because I wanted to be part of his life in a way that work didn't always allow. And he was wrestling with the same thing, caught between the demands of the job and the growing feelings we were both trying to navigate. One Friday evening after a late shift, Nate stopped by my place unannounced. I wasn't expecting him, the apartment quiet except for the low hum of the city outside. When he walked in, he looked exhausted, like he'd been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "I'm sorry I've been MIA, he said, kicking off his boots and collapsing on the couch. "It's been a shit show at the site." I handed him a beer, and we settled into an easy silence for a few minutes. Then he turned to me, eyes a little glassy but determined. "I hate that work's been pulling me away from you. I don't want to lose us, because I'm too tired or stressed." I reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "You're not losing anything. We're just figuring things out, together." He nodded, and for a moment, I thought maybe we'd finally cracked the code on balancing everything. But life, as it often does, had other plans. The next week, the construction site hit a snag. A delay with permits meant that the whole project was pushed back, and the crew was rattled. Nate came home one evening, face tight, and told me they might be down a few people. "Might have to let some guys go," he said quietly. Could be me. That was a punch to the gut I wasn't ready for. We sat on my balcony, the city lights flickering below, and I watched him wrestle with the uncertainty that was suddenly very real. "Maybe we should talk about what this means," I said softly. "For you, for us." He sighed, running a hand through his messy hair. "I don't want to leave the site. It's more than a job. It's home. But I don't know how long this can last if things keep getting worse." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Whatever happens, we'll figure it out. We're not just two guys on a construction site in a tech job. We're a team." That phrase felt heavy but hopeful, like a promise to hold on even when everything felt uncertain. The next few days were a blur, phone calls, meetings, and tense conversations between Nate and his boss. I tried to be there for him, but the worry was hard to shake. Then, one morning, Nate showed up at my door, no hard hat or vest, just a hoodie and that tired smile I loved. "I got laid off," he said, voice rough. My heart sank, but I pulled him inside and wrapped him in a hug. "We'll get through this." We spent hours talking about what came next. Nate was scared, but also kind of relieved. He had time now to think about what he really wanted. Not just to survive, but to build a life that felt fulfilling. Over the next few weeks, Nate threw himself into job hunting, and I tried to support him the best I could. We leaned on each other in ways that surprised me, finding strength in the uncertainty. One evening, as we cooked dinner together, him chopping veggies, me stirring pasta, I realized how much this felt like home. Not the apartment or the street, but us, together, figuring things out. Nate looked over at me, his eyes soft. You know, losing that job was the scariest thing I've been through, but having you here made it bearable. I smiled, reaching across the counter to squeeze his hand. We're building something, remember? And sometimes that means tearing down before we can rebuild. Then came the unexpected. Nate got a call from a small local construction company looking for someone with his skills. It wasn't the big project he'd been working on, but it was steady work, and they liked his experience. When he told me, we celebrated with cheap wine and a lot of laughter, relief washing over us both. That night, as we lay in bed, Nate whispered, "Maybe this is the start of a new kind of building. Not just houses, but a life." I kissed the top of his head, feeling the truth of those words deep in my chest. Life hadn't been easy, but with Nate, it felt like we could handle whatever came next. Together. And honestly, that made all the difference. Months passed after Nate found that new job. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and more importantly, it gave him space to breathe. I saw him relax in ways I hadn't before. Less tension in his shoulders, more late-night laughter, and even those little daydreams about the future creeping back into his eyes. One chilly evening, we found ourselves back on that rooftop, now partially transformed, with a few garden boxes Nate had helped plant. The city lights twinkled below, and the air smelled faintly of earth and growing things. We sat side by side on the unfinished edge, legs dangling over, neither of us needing to fill the silence. After a while, Nate reached over and took my hand, fingers fitting together like they'd always belonged. "You know," he said softly, "I never would have thought a chance meeting on the street would turn into this." I smiled, squeezing his hand. "Neither did I, but I'm glad it did." He turned to me, eyes reflecting the city's glow. "You helped me build more than just a career or a building. You helped me build a life. And I'm grateful for that every day." I looked out over the skyline, feeling the weight of everything we'd been through, the struggles, the uncertainty, the small victories, and how, piece by piece, we'd built something real together. "That's the best kind of construction," I said, laughing softly. "One that lasts." Nate leaned in, resting his forehead against mine. "Here's to building more, together." As we sat there, wrapped up in each other and the quiet hum of the city, I realized that sometimes life's unexpected detours lead you exactly where you're supposed to be. And with Nate beside me, I was ready for whatever came next. No hard hats needed, just us.